Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine presented by the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. You can read all about us online at tertiumquids.org. Join our Tuesday morning group coalition, all of the folks, and as we get closer to our General Assembly elections, understand that our group is one that has actually had positive impact on legislation out of the Virginia House of Delegates, Senate, and even had things signed by not just previous governors, but the current one as well. Joining us to kick off this week's program as we watched last weekend in our flagship city of Charlottesville, Stevie Wonder, not moments after singing "If You Believe in Things You Don't Understand," he started extolling the crowd to take a knee in protest to the inequities of life in America, inspired by millionaire football players who feel, I guess, the inequities in life in America would be better dealt with by communism. Meanwhile, in North Korea, communism is taking hold and is bearing the fruits we should be warning our children about, not extolling the virtues of. To take us into what's going on in North Korea, Senior Fellow for National Security Affairs at the Heritage Institute is Peter Brookes. Peter, welcome back to Freedom and Prosperity Radio. How are you, sir?
Good to be with you.
I pointed this out, and I guess it goes back to January of this year. We had members, newly elected members of the House of Representatives who were sitting on the national security committees who said, I can't get into great detail, but right now I want everyone to understand the most scary part of the world is North Korea. And this was long before Kim Jong-un did most of the saber rattling he's been doing since the presidential inauguration. And it's funny to us as we watch, and it seems like the mainstream media is convinced Kim Jong-un is the seasoned, reasonable leader in the conversations. But it's also a mistake if you characterize Kim Jong-un as somehow insane or crazy. This is not a crazy person. This is somebody who's just taken communism to the only place eventually it ever winds up, isn't it?
Well, I would say he's probably crazy as a fox, although I have no personal dealings with him. We're obviously looking at this individual from the outside. There's not been senior American officials that have met with Kim Jong-un. There's not been senior South Korean officials. I don't even think the president of China has met with Kim Jong-un. So it's very difficult, and I think there's a reason for that. I think there's leaders can benefit in their own way from keeping things mysterious, being ambiguous, being aloof, staying away from dialogue and conversations with other senior foreign leaders. So it's very difficult to say, but I have to say they seem to be committed to their ballistic and nuclear missile programs, and it's something that is an increasing threat to the United States.
What should, and not necessarily how we have gone about it, but certainly as our allies have been threatened by this, what if there was a better course of action, or are we on really the only course of action, which is to make sure that this nuclear power understands the consequences of firing nuclear missiles or detonating H-bombs in the middle of the Pacific as they've threatened, Peter?
Well, I think they need to be deterred, and they need to be dissuaded from taking these sort of actions. I think it was important for the administration to have a strong declaratory policy. The president has been unambiguous in reminding North Korea that if they start a fight with the United States, that it will end badly for North Korea and will be the end of the regime. They need to understand this. They need to be deterred and understand that the strength of the United States and its South Korean allies would lead to the end of North Korea, essentially. I mean, we certainly don't want to go in that direction. We don't want to have a conventional war, and we certainly don't want it to escalate above that. But they need to understand that we have the strength to defend ourselves and retaliate in a serious way against North Korean aggression. The challenge is to manage the risks that we're dealing with that is coming out of North Korea, which is an increasing risk, unfortunately.
Now, my father fought for the U.S. Army in Korea, And what has changed in those intervening 60 years since the segregated countries, the ceasefire was settled, that would make it more likely this time that the Western powers could be victorious in the Korean Peninsula that weren't there in 1957?
Well, the Korean War started in 1950, and it was ended in armistice in 1953, and the Korean Peninsula has been divided ever since then along the 38th parallel. I think the significant changes that I've seen on the Korean Peninsula, of course, is the tremendous development politically, economically, and militarily of South Korea since then. I mean, South Korea is a major power in that part of the world and even globally. An incredibly successful democracy, incredibly successful economically, and has a tremendous military force that most people don't talk about. When we talk about North Korea, we often talk about the United States, but South Korea is a military power in its own right on the Korean Peninsula. So that's a significant development. The other thing is that North Korea, there's two things. There's two ways of looking at it. One is that it's lost its client state status with the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. I received a lot of aid and military equipment during the Cold War from the Soviet Union. That is no longer the case. They have an interesting and I would say strained relationship with the Chinese, but they are an alliance partner of the Chinese. In fact, the Chinese came out and said something I think is unprecedented publicly in one of their an English language newspaper, which is a mouthpiece of the Chinese government, the Chinese leadership. They basically said to North Korea several weeks ago that if you start a war with the United States, you can't expect that we'll come to your rescue. And they also said to the United States, if you start a war with North Korea, don't expect us to remain neutral. So that's really interesting because the Chinese supported the North Korean invasion of South Korea in 1950, and then when the U.S. forces, following General Douglas MacArthur's landing at Incheon, pushed the North Koreans back towards the Chinese border, the Chinese sent 200,000 troops over the border, became much more involved in the war, and which led to it ending in an armistice. The war has never ended, but an armistice or ceasefire along the lines we see today at the 38th parallel in 1953. So and North Korea is not an economic power other than its ballistic missile and nuclear weapons programs. They do have a large army, a 1 million-man army. It's very dangerous, but it's not on the level of capabilities of the United States or even South Korea.
Peter Brookes, Senior Fellow for National Security Affairs at the Heritage Foundation, is on with us this week's Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Peter, you were talking about the economic power of South Korea, and certainly I think the argument can be made by and to Americans who seem to be fancifully looking at communism as a way forward that in 1953, as you said, North and South Korea were economically fairly similar, and since then, not so much. How much of North Korea's attitude towards its nuclear program has to do with their economic problems? There's famine that we're getting reports about in the country. There are food shortages. There are massive economic problems, and his regime, the Kim regime, looking to South Korea's prosperity and saying we should unify this country, and ostensibly not out of any idea of unity, but more out of the idea of we want their money because they're Koreans too, and we should benefit from all of this prosperity in the South.
I don't think that North Korea is interested in unifying with the South as a partner. They're interested in unifying with the South militarily if necessary under North Korean rule.
Well, that's kind of
which
what
would
I
be
meant.
Communist rule.
Well, that's what I meant. But they wanted the money, the prosperity over the last few decades in South Korea that has grown to, similarly to the way Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, not so much out of a territorial spat, but out of really a bank robbery to take their treasury with him when he evacuated the country. This is really more of the idea of, hold it, we're broke, they're not. We should get that money.
No, I don't see that at all, quite frankly. The North Koreans have a philosophy of juche, which is a philosophy of self-reliance, and they would never adopt South Koreans' open market economy. And that's the reason that North Korea is so poor today. It's because of its collectivist communist policies, and that resulted in the famine. Now, it is true that North Korea probably spends about half of its government funding on the military, but they could do much better if they change their economic policies to feed the country and to develop itself economically. So, yeah, I've never heard that they were after South Korea's wealth because the only way they could retain that would be to adopt those sort of Western capitalist policies, which is an anathema to their current political and economic philosophy. So I just don't see. I guess we can both look at it the same picture and see things differently. But they've had opportunities. In fact, over the years, many times in exchange for their nuclear and ballistic missile programs, they've been offered economic development from the outside. They've been offered reunification. They've been offered a peace treaty, and they've turned it down. They have not been interested in others helping them develop themselves economically because they think that their system works, which is obviously to many of us doesn't seem to be the case, but they believe in it.
What about and certainly we watched as the Soviet Union's communist government collapsed economically, but given the fact that the dear leader, the deity-style leadership that's almost Maoist, only, it carries within the family, the Kim family, there is certainly a different style of communism and collectivism in North Korea than there is even in China, where even at the passing of Mao, their new leaders were added to the story, and certainly in the Soviet Union there was never that deity leadership the way they seem to have in North Korea. Address that in terms of a national security issue, and how do you deal with a country that for all these years has almost been a communist cult?
Well, it is a dynasty. The country was founded by Kim Il-sung, and that's Kim Jong-un, the current leader's grandfather, and then he was followed by Kim Jong-il, who is Kim Jong-un's father. And it's definitely a Kim dynasty. And I think, that's one of the things, points of pressure is to remind them that if they were to start a war or undertake aggression against South Korea or the United States, that it would be the end of the Kim dynasty, which makes it a little bit more personal as opposed to a communist party in general. So right. I think this is the case, and as people have said, including the president, that he better be careful he's not on a suicide mission here. And a lot of us don't think that Kim is suicidal, in that he prefers the continuance of the Kim regime over starting a war with the United States. So I think they're going to threaten, and they do this all the time. It's not there's probably more of it now, and people are paying more attention of it, but it's a regular thing because they have to sell this bill of goods to their people that they're under threat, which is not the case at all. The United States and South Korea have never talked about invading North Korea.
Right.
We're in a defensive posture. That's important for people to understand. We have not threatened North Korea. We do show there are demonstrations of strength to remind North Korea that we will respond. And North Korea has done many horrible things to the United States over the years. The taking of the Pueblo. They shot down a Navy reconnaissance aircraft the same year, 1969. 30-some lives were lost. They had their soldiers attack Americans trimming trees in the demilitarized zone in 1976. They've been involved in terrorist acts against the South Koreans, and we have not invaded the country. So, but they have to sell this bill of goods to the people to make them understand the privation that they live with, self-imposed privation they live with, and they say it's because of the United States and South Korea and that they're going to invade and take over the country, which is not the case at all.
Is that why they hold such a tight grip over information? Of course, Charlottesville, our flagship city, we've had our own tragedies, but seeming to obscure just this week, the Warmbier family spoke on television for the first time about the loss of their son, UVA student Otto Warmbier, while visiting North Korea. And again, a reminder of what happens in communist dictatorships with people who express what we would consider just, he's heaven forbid you kneel before an athletic event instead of honoring the flag, but he just took a banner down out of a kitchen.
Well, North Korea is a total police state, and obviously it's a terrible tragedy involving that American student.
But that's how could they
I've been
control.
to North Korea, and I was there as a congressional staffer. So it's different circumstances, clearly, but it is a total police state. We couldn't leave the hotel and move around as we wished. While we were in North Korea, we had constant minders. I assume that the rooms I stayed in were bugged. Mm-hmm. This is what you're dealing with in North Korea, and the real tragedy, of course, is or one of the other tragedies is the fact that 22 million people need to live under this regime.
Yeah,
these
dying.
People have no choice. They are the victims, and that's one of the things, the challenges when people hear about countries sending food aid there. They say, well, how could you send food aid to them? But, the North Korean people are the real victims here on a day-to-day basis it's hard for us to comprehend since it's not a place that many people travel to.
Well, the reason I ask you about the tight lockdown on information, certainly part of the fraying of the Soviet dictatorship in Russia was the more Western stuff would get in there little by little, and then a little bit more and a little bit more. Is there enough Western, even across the border from South Korea? I've read stories of the work crews that go into South Korea and come into. They're very tightly controlled, as you depicted, Peter, and very tightly watched as well, so as to not be infected by anything they might see in the South if they're there. As a work crew, is there information? Are there people in North Korea who are saying, we're screwing ourselves up here and we need to change this and change it from within rather than without? Because really the only holistic way to change something like this is to finally have the people say enough is enough, like they did in Russia.
There is no dissident movement in North Korea, to my knowledge. It's much too dangerous. This is repression on an unprecedented level, and it's also a different culture than you see in places like Eastern Germany or Russia, for instance. Mm-hmm. Probably closer to Chinese culture in terms of how they view things. But there's, to my knowledge, and I may not have complete knowledge on this, to my knowledge, there's never been a coup attempt in North Korea. Now, there have been rumors of them, but it doesn't appear they got very far. And the rumors may not be accurate because it's a very hard place to get information out of. But yes, there is. I don't believe that there is a dissident movement or a reformist movement in North Korea. And as you've seen, there's been tremendous purges there since Kim Jong-un has taken power, and some of the stories are horrific.
Even within his own family.
And talking about public executions, anti-aircraft guns, things along this line. And I can't verify any of that. But people, certainly is the prison camp. They have political prison camps in North Korea. And when you go to a political prison camp, it's not only you that goes, but your family goes. It is a human rights nightmare. And I think I think people are comfortable in that assessment.
What about the UN's role? I mean, certainly the UN was designed around the idea of human rights and being able to be a place where everyone could go. The president, I think, spoke eloquently to the United Nations regarding human rights violations in some of these countries. Do you think they need to step up and do more? And what can we do to perhaps encourage that behavior at the United Nations level?
There are a lot of people who are doing wonderful things and very challenging work. to help the human rights situation in North Korea, but it's a very tough subject.
Mm-hmm.
They don't just allow anybody to travel there. It's very, very difficult to get a visa to go to North Korea. But there are agencies from the UN to other human rights agencies that are highlighting this sort of thing, but affecting change there is extremely difficult, and it's been an undertaking of many good people for many years, and it sits where it sits, not because of the efforts that have been undertaken, but because of the difficulty of the problem.
Peter Brookes is Senior Fellow National Security Affairs at the Heritage Foundation. I've also heard testimony from other national security efforts that shooting a North Korean missile launch out of the sky is not something the United States would want to do because of our stand down and our demilitarization and our de-escalation of some of our missile programs. We don't have that many to start shooting down missiles out of the sky. Not to say we don't have them, and not to say we don't have way more than the North Koreans do, but if we start shooting test missiles out of the sky, we're going to have fewer and fewer there for our own defense. Is that a concern, and is that something the president's military budget needs to address?
I don't think that that's the case. I mean, I think you have to basically reserve those missiles, and I think we do need more missile defenses and more missile defense capabilities. There's no question about that. But you have to make a decision whether you're going to shoot down a test missile or not. If it's a live missile, then you definitely want to do that. Mm-hmm. And if it threatens your territory or interests of your allies, but I don't know. I don't think that's the case at all. I think if we were to see something fired in the direction of Guam that could threaten Guam, that we would shoot that missile down. The same with Alaska or any place else in the Pacific. Mm-hmm. Now there are challenges of physics and geometry in terms of shooting down a missile, but I don't think it's that I think it's the question of the threat level. Mm-hmm. Is this a threat, or is this a test? And even though we don't like the testing, we've gone time and time again to the United Nations over their violations of UN Security Council resolutions on missile testing and missile firings. We have to make a decision as to whether shooting a test missile down would lead to an escalation of tensions or even into conflict. So these are the challenges that policymakers have to weigh every time when they're dealing with North Korea or anybody else who's involved in some sort of belligerence.
Peter, last one, the North Korean connections with Iran and what seems to be very similar sounding deals, one in the Clinton administration, one in the Obama administration over, we've made a great deal and they're not going to develop a nuclear program. Is there a concern that Iran's nuclear armament program is being helped by their association with North Korea?
I think there's little doubt that there is some collaboration and sharing of technology. In fact, we know it. It's unclear the depth of it, but right. The Iranian missile programs, ballistic missile programs, early on, and may still be based on North Korean missiles that were transferred going back to the 1990s. So we know that's the case. The depth on the nuclear issue on the outside of government, it's unclear to me. But I assume it. They have a science and technical agreement that was made public. The aspects of that are not known, at least outside in public sources. It could be just conventional weaponry, but it certainly could move to weapons of mass destruction. And that's something definitely to be concerned about.
It's a scary premise. It reminds me of, Henry Kissinger once speaking about why the U.S. and Russia having, multiple times over the ability to lay waste to the planet Earth was really more to keep these little rogue regimes from getting one nuclear missile or five and thinking that created a world power out of them. And it seems to make a lot more sense now in these days. Peter, last, a final punctuation mark. What is your thought as to what's going to play out over the next few months regarding North Korea, if you had a crystal ball?
I think to be continuing tensions, and I'm very skeptical that North Korea has will be willing to come to the negotiating table to trade away their nuclear program. They might come to the table, but they have no intention of trading away their nuclear program. I think they see it as a life insurance policy, and I doubt very much, as I would wish this weren't the case, but I'm convinced to the idea that they will not trade away that program because they see it as so valuable to the future of the North Korean regime.
Peter, thank you so much for spending some time with us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. And, of course, read all of his stuff at heritage.org. And thank you so much for your contributions to this week's program, and continue the great work there at Heritage.
Thank you.
And we'll come right back. We've got Roger Alt coming up next, Robert Alt next on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. My name is Joe Thomas, and you can find out more about our organization, the work we do, public policy initiatives, and as we get closer to the General Assembly elections, what we're looking for in November and what we're going to look for the next General Assembly session. Joining us on the line is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Buckeye Institute and an expert on constitutional matters. He is Robert Alt. Thank you for joining us, Robert, and welcome to Freedom and Prosperity Radio. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me on today.
No, not at all. And one of these stories that we talk about individual liberty and a lot of constitutional issues in abstract, but one of the places we've seen a great erosion, not only in interest but in liberty, is in the public workforce. And I know that unionization has been waning in the private sector and expanding in the public sector. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the organization of the future in unions in the workforce. Are they fading? Are they becoming an endangered species because they've ceased to represent their members? And what can be done to repair that relationship, even if it is worthy of being repaired?
Well, I think once again, if you take a look, the one area of sort of the unionized workforce that has been more stable has been the public sector unions. Again, we're talking about those unions that represent public employees. That could be teachers, that could be working for various agencies, and certainly it's been a major move in recent years to try by the unions to try and grow these workforces and these union forces. That said, there's always a concern, and unions across the board, as to how representative they really are of the workers who they're supposed to be representing. I thought it was really interesting in the Washington Post a while back. The head of one of the major public sector unions conceded that functionally he said we had taken our members for granted. We weren't even communicating with them well. And, of course, at a certain point, I suppose it makes sense because, they didn't really need to. Whether they were doing a good job, a bad job, or no job at all, the workers who they were supposed to be representing didn't really have a voice or a choice. And I think that this goes to a pretty startling statistic, which is if you take a look at unions across the country, 94% of unionized workers have never had the opportunity to vote, to have a vote on the union that's representing them.
That's stunning.
In most cases, those unions were put into place before they started working. In some cases, before they were even born.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, it's many cases, especially some of the legacy companies that are still holding on to their unionized workforce. But one of the questions I've always had about public sector unions, and it's one of those rare instances where on a public policy level I agreed with Franklin Delano Roosevelt as to the concerns, and I believe that he spoke to this as well, that there's no real danger of the client, the employer, going out of business. If you're a union president and your shop is the GM automotive factory, of course, maybe this is a bad example in the post-bailout world, but if your union makes vacuum cleaners, you can conceivably force the vacuum cleaner either out of business or out of the country to continue their manufacturing if you overplay your hand. But if you're a public sector union president, number one, your employees don't really have a lot of options in terms of who to work for, and number two, your contractee has no choice in the matter if you're a police officer or a hospital worker that's municipally employed or a traffic maintenance, roadway maintenance man. They're not going to go out of business. The government can't go out of business the same way a vacuum cleaner manufacturer can.
I mean, that's a key distinction. The other thing that obviously distinguishes, I'd say there's a couple other things worth keeping in mind with regard to public sector unions. One is the risk that you have with, in certain ways you could say the same interest being on both sides of the negotiating table. So if you've got the public sector unions making major contributions through their PACs to political candidates, then those same political candidates are in some measure on the opposite side of the negotiating table with them with regard to the contracts. You can see where this could create at least the appearance, if not the reality, of some sort of a conflict of interest.
Yeah, absolutely.
The second big issue, and it's one that I think has come to light more in recent years, is the impact. Is the constitutional questions. If you're dealing with public sector workers, you have to remember that the First Amendment is going to apply to them in the workplace.
Mm-hmm.
The government can't force them with regard to certain speech and association in the same way, perhaps, that a private employer who wouldn't be covered by the First Amendment could. And so you take a look, for instance, at the Rebecca Friedrichs case from just a little over a year ago. Friedrichs was a teacher in California, and she raised serious constitutional concerns. Went all the way up to the Supreme Court. They deadlocked on the 4-4, so there wasn't really a decision of the court. They simply had to affirm the lower court's judgment because Scalia had passed, and so there wasn't a fifth vote for a majority either way. But she raised very serious constitutional concerns about the fact that, look, in this case, you're forcing me to associate with a union who is speaking in a way that I wouldn't. And even in the context of collective bargaining, the collective bargaining speech, too frequently she found ended up supporting teachers who may have engaged in abusive or other practices, or that the collective bargaining speech that they engaged in did not sufficiently merit or was opposed to merit as a basis for determining salary or layoffs. And so once again, she said, look, that I shouldn't be forced to speak in that way. So that's another big distinction with regard to the public sector unions. And again, I tend to think that this ends up being a huge problem because of the lack of the voice and the choice, because of the fact that these workers have never had the opportunity to vote for their union representation. They inherited it. It's an heirloom, if you will, from a previous era. Their grandfather's union has been handed down to them. And so because of that, you can see, 85% of Ohioans who we ended up polling believed that the unions would be more responsive, more accountable if they were subjected to regular votes. And that, that of course just makes sense. We've all seen that ourselves in our own private business dealings, where there's competition that improves the accountability, the quality, and the price of the particular product. and there's no reason to believe that that wouldn't be the same case with regard to unions.
Well, and you bring up a great point that we've seen frequently and most often played out in the automotive industry, where the UAW will strike GM and under the threat that, well, we'll strike, we'll shut you down, and everyone will go buy Fords and Chryslers. And it seems to, cycle through each contract. Then they'll strike Chrysler, saying, well, we'll strike, and everyone will buy Fords. But yet the business owners have no such recourse. They can't say to a union, well, go ahead, we're going to bring in Union Y, and they're going to try to represent some of our union, some of our workforce as well. There is no competition amongst unions, and they do tend to become very gentrified of the idea that they can just do whatever they want without fear of losing their position.
But in fact, there could be competition. Once again, if the workers were allowed to vote on a regular basis as to whether they wanted to keep their union, get rid of their union, or choose a different union, oftentimes there are multiple different unions that could potentially cover a single workplace. So they would be able to have a genuine choice. And additionally, if you had this sort of a system, it would actually permit other unions to be formed as well to address the concerns and to give more choice. Right now, of course, you don't have that opportunity. It's almost impossible to decertify the union. They've set massive obstacles in the way, and again, prevent the workers from having any reasonable opportunity to vote. I mean, just to give one example, in Columbus, where I live, the Columbus Teachers Association, the local teachers union, was certified back in the late 60s, back during the Nixon administration, to represent the teachers in Columbus. But if you go into a random classroom, a random elementary school classroom in Columbus, the teacher who you're going to see in front of the class likely was born later than 1968. So they weren't even born, never had an opportunity to vote, and so they're stuck with that union whether they want it or not. Ultimately, that's just not fair. The unions, a number of unions actually in their past had done a lot to make sure that the franchise was expanded, that people had reasonable voting rights. We believe they should be open to this for their own membership. They should actually give the members a real vote with regard to whether or not to keep their union, get rid of their union, or choose a different union. And the interesting thing is, union members agree. 90% of Ohio union households support having regular periodic elections for their union to give them that voice and choice.
Is this a state's issue where state by state, here in Virginia, we're a right-to-work state, so many workplaces aren't unionized, but schools certainly see teachers' unions wield a lot of influence. Though interestingly enough, you'd think that a teachers' union would take the side of a teacher that might want to teach in a different way, but they often just take the side of the school board. As you said earlier, they seem to be hooked into the politician side of the equation rather than the rank-and-file member side of it. But is this something where each state has to go through this, or is this something that needs to come from the federal government requiring these public sector unions to submit to more scrutiny at a ballot box, even on a regular basis?
This is a reform that could go one of at least two different roads. One, you can do it at a state level. The states are permitted to go ahead and grant these worker voting rights to public sector workers, and so you could see this state by state. Now, obviously, in a state like Ohio, I think the case is even stronger because we're not a right-to-work state like Virginia. So in addition to not having a genuine choice or a vote with regard to your union, you're also obviously in a position as, for instance, a school teacher, where if you didn't pay your union dues or your agency fees, the government would be required to fire you. So I think that's just, sort of adding insult to injury. You don't have a choice with regard to your union. You never get a vote, and if you don't go ahead and pay your dues, then you're going to get fired. In a right-to-work state like Virginia, you don't have that threat of being fired, but again, you still have not had the opportunity to actually have a vote, to have your voice and choice. And so because of that, I think you still end up with a number of those accountability questions. And the question is as to whether or not the union is truly representing the interest of those members. And so I still think even in a right-to-work state, it's important that a reform like this be pursued. So this is the sort of thing that you could pursue on a statewide basis in Virginia. The other alternative, you could potentially address the issue through federal legislation. I know there's been at least one bill introduced along these lines in Congress, but I used to work in Washington. I moved out and I work in the states now for a reason. I tend to find the states really are those laboratories of democracy, and that just in terms of actually getting things done in terms of reforms, I think that the better bet is on the states. They're actually far more aggressive in protecting individuals, and in this case, I think that reform that would favor workers like this, the better avenue is probably through the states. But again, it could go through either route.
Robert Alt of the Buckeye Institute, we were talking about some of the instances where this has happened. Is the example of Wisconsin and Governor Scott Walker taking the political risk of trying to break up the grip of public sector unions on the state and living to tell the tale despite the slings and arrows and the marshaled forces of the union movement, even after he got the General Assembly to break up the unions, the public sector unions in Wisconsin. Is that an important example to elected officials, especially as they discuss workers' voting rights and public sector unions as a concept in general?
Well, I think you can take a look. There's been a couple of states, actually, that have instituted worker voting rights in some format or another. First example I would give is Tennessee, which has actually implemented it specifically for the teachers' unions, where the teachers' unions have to sit for re-election every 3 years. And again, it provides the choice to the teachers, gives them the opportunity to have an up or down vote for their union, and gives them the opportunity as well then, if they decided against a union, to look at another union as the potential representative of their voting bloc. Similarly, Wisconsin also, one of the reforms that they passed was the opportunity for members to vote for or against their public sector unions. So both of those are very important. And they're important specifically in terms of how it is that they've empowered the workers, the public sector workers, to genuinely have a choice with regard to their union representation. The key here is, again, this is not something that it's not about shutting down the unions. It's about making sure that the workers have a genuine choice as to whether or not they want to be represented by a union and which union should be representing them.
Last question on the subject of public sector unions, and this has bothered me for some time. It seems that more and more public policy is written to benefit the police unions rather than the liberties, the constitutionally protected liberties of the citizens. And you see frequently, whether it be stop and frisk or other campaigns that are patently unconstitutional, are put forth in a way to, again, make the Patrolmen's Benevolent Association happy so that they'll endorse the next mayor candidate, or as a thank you for endorsing the current mayoral or city council candidates as well. Have we seen an erosion in this particular realm of public sector unions, the police unions, of individual citizens' liberty in an overbalancing to protect the workforce of the patrolmen's unions?
I can't speak to that with regard to. I'd have to take a look at the particulars to see if how much the unions have played with regard to those particular policies. And whether sometimes obviously it might have been the union association, sometimes it might be some other association that represents the patrolmen. So I I don't have an example of that off the top of my head. So
okay, well, I'm sorry, I didn't.
In particular. Oh no, that's fine. Just, obviously, in terms of these questions, even there, I suppose the question would be whether or not one of the big questions from a worker voting rights perspective would be whether or not the perspectives taken by the union actually reflect the views of the workers as well in that workforce, beyond the question of whether or not that's the right public policy. And that what you're asking about the public policy is a larger question, but in many of these things, there's the serious question as well as to whether or not the position taken by the union is the one that the rank and file members want. And right now, again, if in fact it's not, there's precious little that the workers can do. They don't really have any serious check on the union, whereas worker voting rights would give them that check.
Robert Alt is the president and CEO of the Buckeye Institute. Thank you so much for spending some time. Our listeners can read more at buckeyeinstitute.org and read more about the workers' voting rights issue. And thank you so much for joining us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. And they can also go, we actually have a site set up just to address this particular issue, workervotingrights.org.
Workervotingrights.org. We'll make sure we link that up on our social media as well. Robert Alt, thank you so much again, and thanks for joining us this week.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And thank you for listening on behalf of all of us here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. Until next weekend across the Commonwealth, I'm Joe Thomas. So long, and thanks for all the fish.